Got the great pleasure to introduce now our next speaker, Eileen Myles, as well as Nancy Spero. Eileen is going to read more poetry following on her reading yesterday, but she's also going to read a poem which was selected by Nancy Spero. Nancy Spero, born in 1926 in Cleveland, Ohio, lives and works in New York City, has worked as an artist and activist over more than 50 years. Recent exhibition at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, as well as the 52nd Venice Biennale in Venice. Nancy has, for many, many decades, worked with poetry, from her famous Artaud Codex to her dialogues with contemporary poets, and has chosen a poem which Eileen will read. Eileen needs no introduction because you all met her yesterday. I just wanted to mention her recent books, The Importance of Being Iceland, essays from 2009, Sorry, 3 poems from 2007, and again mention also that you can find books in the bookshop by all the poets reading. A very, very warm welcome to Eileen Myles and also to Nancy Spero.
Hi. You know, I was just thinking, sitting here for 2 days, that one of the things that's kind of amazing about this event is I'm a poet, and it's the first poetry marathon I've ever seen happen outside of the poetry world, which is what's, I think, completely weird about this event. I mean, so I think it's the first, like, postmodern poetry marathon, i.e. it's sort of like, isn't that the thing that you always move out of your own medium? And, you know, so we're all someplace else, you know, for these 2 days, which is sort of great. So in that spirit, it's sort of terrific that, so Nancy Spero, I'm transmitting the body of Nancy Spero, transmitting the body of her young writer friend who's named Dana Yarabek. So I'll read her piece. And one thing, I just want to reflect, one thing I've noticed too about visual artists when they move into poetry, they are sort of I guess, low tech. You know, which is like kind of the radical simplicity of moving into somebody else's medium. So this seems to me kind of low tech, and I like it. I like it for that. Though oddly, she seems to dislike hens, servants, and nursemaids. But I don't know Dana, so I haven't asked her why. But it has this sort of 18th century title. When I heard you found a fat man who could make you sing, goodbye my hopes, I said in candlelight, and grew a beard. I made cups with my winter hands and moved them over each other. I rearranged the place settings at a distracting pace, the way old Pop had done when the dinner was cleared away. But there was no meat in the pie. There was no pie at all. All food resembled gray heaps of felt, vague and dry in the throat. No second helpings, please. Had I the forethought of shoveling coal, I would have left my spoon alone. I dug it in the meaty mush and flung it on the wall. So strange was this plate that they'd been serving me that it stuck to the wall like putty. And it made a thud so satisfying that I flung spoonful after spoonful until the pie was gone and the plate was clean. Only then did my maids rush in to inquire about the sound. Just as they were ready to make a fuss, their eyes widened at my empty plate. They held on to each other's proper forearms as if in fear and looked at each other for proof. Then the two proper hens, they squawked, heavens, dear, he's finished his supper. Oh me, oh my. Then they hurried to the table, making a trench around me and cooing like nursemaids. I was convinced this kind of merriment happened every day and that my presence was irrelevant. And I scowled and growled and ground my knuckles into my cheeks. They frolicked and sang out of the dining room back to their roost. Fools, golden anchors. I kept my scowl on. I'd become so accustomed to it that, in fact, if I forgot it, my face felt uncomfortably even and clean. No shit in the cracks, grit in the teeth. Scrape, scrape, tick, tick. I looked up at the mush mound on the wall. It hadn't moved at all. I walked over to this lump. I studied it until it looked familiar. Ha! It was my trophy mound, my prize doe. It was just as lifeless as I and just as dubious still. And for this, I felt an immediate bond. We could not make dead, meaty eyes at each other, nor could we grumble over our ale. We could only do what two dead deer could do, decorate, brave death. Yay. So I wanted to I wanted to kind of surround it with something. I mean, I guess I'm sort of a competitive artist, so I thought if she's going to do low tech, I kind of want to do no tech, which is, so I'm going to read a little piece from, I got this book that's kind of about Iceland and kind of about art and kind of about queerness, but there's this part where the narrator is kind of lost in Iceland. And eventually she arrives at this kind of beautiful landscape in Iceland. She finds herself hitchhiking and in a truck and feeling the landscape. And then it takes her to a kind of a realization about poetry. And Iceland has this incredible poetry history, which is with no tech at all. We drive through the most gorgeous landscape I've ever seen. It was a landscape hard to believe. The man's name was like Vic. He was a farmer and the son of a farmer, and his father was a farmer too. He laughs about it with his eyes on the road. He drove up and down these rolling curves over bright green mountains and fjords and waterfalls, incessantly plural, and something hydroelectric would come up every now and then. He called out the names of the fjords to me. That is Eagle's Fjord. Do you know Eagle's Saga? Well, I know some of the sagas. I've heard of it. He smiled. I even napped. In the bright lichen-covered landscape, I bobbed and drooled. It sounds like a baby, but I think I felt like a man. I think a man is safe like this in the world, and a woman never is. So it was a masculine feeling when I woke up. I opened my eyes, and here it was again. Magnificent, a waterfall, and then he stopped. I took some pictures along the way, though that's when one of my cameras failed. Here's one, though. It's a waterfall coming down a mountain in blurry stripes, the worst picture in the world, but it didn't look like that. Most astonishingly, this landscape is alive, the bigness of it going on. I was in awe of my farmer friend and anyone to have grown up on this land and to have that be the history of your family in some way seems almost not worth thinking about. It's so wonderful and strange. It's a fixity I can't rewrite. I can know the television set. I can know the boat. I tip my hat to the unknowing. Like there's a glass wall in my intelligence and my reaching for it. I learned more about the West Fjords, I'll tell you in a bit, the most amazing part. I had come to the perfect part of the country to learn and to hold more, and when he introduced me to the fjords, I understood, of course, that these were superheroes. That there was actually pride still in their names. I mean, the words attached to the land. Now, I'm going to go into a piece that's a little bit about musical composition, and there's some vocabulary in there that I don't entirely understand, and I wrote it. So it's sort of in the spirit of the event. I think there's a lot of unknowing. I think a marathon takes us to a state of unknowing, so we're all going there together. And I mentioned a guy named David now, and it's David Rattray, a very great poet and translator. David died in 1993. He read and wrote and translated a phenomenal number of poems, articles, stories in the years, then months preceding his death. I carted some of it away. A handful of the books on my shelf are his, mostly unread. He was obsessed with Icelandic sagas for a while, which are the first written prose pieces we have. There's a big debate among scholars about whether they were a written work or a transcription of oral tales. I say, what's the difference? What I like is the notion of an immanent saga. That's a story known regionally by all in several versions. And if you're not telling it locally, you tell it a little different again. Ultimately, if you were going to write one version, you would need to capture both approaches so that the local version would include what's in it for everybody, and yet each turn would be a little bit out. You would feel yourself standing in both kinds of community, knowledge, by the time the story is done. Written down, I mean. The motive for collecting, for writing, I think, is to show the entire approach. I took the book. David spoke about these Icelandic couples, old people who traveled around the country on winter nights, a man and a woman reciting as a team these ancient poems in some kind of chant song. The idea moved him in a special way. I felt like it was a reflection of he and his wife Lynn, reunited in the last years of his life before he died. I've read the one saga he gave me, Nal's saga, and Nal dies in his own house, set on fire by the enemies who pursued him. The couples I think David was into sang Svangar, a really old kind of song, I'm guessing, and are part of Icelandic history, though they pretty much stopped existing by the 1920s. But all over Iceland, before it achieved nationhood in 1936, it was like New York between the wars, and now again, when no building occurred. I mean, any island, even Manhattan, has a way of staying on a tune much longer than anyone else until that tune is the tune of the place itself. In Icelandic churches, since they lacked organs and vaulted roofs that amplified, they even determined the kind of singing that went on in a person's body. Churches were turf, not resonance, so the singing occurred only in the throat and the chest because something has to vibrate, but not the building. It's us, the singers. All the churchgoers were singing the same hymn, not the same notes or tunes. No organ tone set the pitch, so they could find it instead among themselves. People were literally singing their hearts out. When the organ was introduced in the 30s, some of the older people stopped going to church because the idea of everybody singing the same tune at once seemed obscene to them. It offended their Icelandic sense of religiosity or privacy or just their understanding of what being part of a community could mean. The radio also upset the apple cart with the same songs played over and over with the same versions and the same notes. It's amazing to think about what the radio might have upset. I'm getting this from all sides. I heard about the singing, and then I read about it, and finally the book I read was co-written by a composer that my friend Mark studied with. These rediscoveries are not accidental. There's an imprecise mourning needed to see where we are now. I think it's like the species rediscovering itself, learning to be stubborn in our awkward speaking and hearing. All over the world, regional accents are vanishing because of the homogenizing powers of announcers' voices normalizing everything until everything started to go away, the landscape and the voices. There's an ecology of sound, of speech. We have to think about what English does, riding roughshod over national poetries that since the room is small and no one's in there, why not step out to the bright light of day and write in English, think like us, speaking the language of the global crash. People are standing outside in Reykjavik demonstrating, demanding the prime minister steps down. I can't read the signs, but I get it. All over Iceland since the 14th century, there was this kind of epic poetry singing called Veiðskapur. It continued to exist until around the 20s and the 30s when it began to be codified in terms of pitch and musical contours. The distinguishing characteristic of the singing was a variable voice, which always sang the poem with differing melody. Sameness, however, was requested of the singers when they were recording, but they were intrinsically doing something else. The writer described the singer gritting his teeth to complete a line. They talk about the substance of the poem, even that the words and the voice could be weighed and were related specifically in some way to personal life, age, and environment. And that the style that continued longer in this region, the West Fjords, than anywhere else was because of its physical isolation. Though I'm also thinking about the contours of the land. I haven't heard this poetry singing yet, but the idea has its maximum effect on my thinking at this moment. I'm making it up, what it sounds like, though two of the last living Veiðimadur say that that's exactly how they began to do it. One man explained, I think it has to be interpersonal a little. A Veiðimadur sings both traditional poetry sagas and also writes his own new poems. Typically, the Veiðimadur denies authorship. He or she, there were female Veiðimadur too, didn't steal it. He just didn't write it. Maybe the implication being the poem just kind of grew. Typically, a Veiðimadur would go into a kind of trance state for 7 months of the year, just in the evenings, if I'm getting it right. Or maybe the evenings was when he would perform for other people. The light would be dim in the house, and the little bit that there was would be for him to lean over the text and read and sing. So the thread of the group would not be the light, but the sound of his voice, like a kind of limited local radio. The Veiðimadur would be at work during the day. He would sing all day long. The author of the book said that he interviewed one of these last guys, and there would be long pauses between his answers. And then the interviewer realized that the man was speaking in verse. He lived in poetry all day long. It was his water, his language. He'd be in a fishing boat, and he'd be singing the third stanza of a poem all the way to shore, again and again, singing the last stanza as he landed. It sounds like the poems are kind of metric verse, like counting is okay, but how they are sung is the lively part, the irregularity of that. Poets write poems for the singer, to make room for them in the poem. Each song has a kind of pitch that runs through the whole song, and the melody embellishes it. The singer drops his energy at the end of the line, and then several people in the room come in vocally and sing the end of the line for and with him. They hold him up, so to speak. One man said, though he was referring to breath, to his power, which faded as he grew old, that what one chiefly needed to sing Veda is courage. Thanks.